Welcome to Informatica Cloud Tier 1 on-demand course Informatica Cloud REST API. After completing this module, you will be able to understand the capabilities of the Informatica Cloud REST API and discuss some common use cases of the REST API. You will also access and use the API documentation and XSD. You will know how to configure request messages and understand how to handle the response messages. In the earlier module, we discussed what web services are, their types, and their functionalities with special focus on RESTful web services. Let us now discuss what are the REST APIs. A REST API defines a set of functions which users can execute to send requests and receive responses using the HTTP protocol. The REST API should specify what functionalities it can provide and how to use them in detail. These information include request and response format, query parameters, HTTP method to be used such as GET, POST, PUT, or delete, language support, callback usage, etc. Some common examples of the REST APIs include Twitter REST API, Informatica Cloud REST API, etc. We will discuss the Informatica Cloud REST API in the coming slides. Let us start with an overview of the Informatica Cloud REST API. You can use the Informatica Cloud REST API to access information from your Informatica Cloud org, as well as perform tasks such as running tasks and task flows and updating connections and schedules. The REST API includes a complete set of resources that allow you to access information from the activity log and activity monitor, audit log entries, as well as information about the Informatica Cloud org. You can also access details for objects in the org, which includes task and task flows, agents, connections, schedules, users, and much more. In addition to accessing information, you can use the API to perform several tasks such as create new objects or update existing objects. These objects may include tasks and task flows, connections, users, schedules, and user permissions. You can also use the API to delete objects from the org. For completing all the tasks, you do not need to manually log in to your Informatica Cloud org if you're using the Informatica Cloud REST API. There are several advantages of using Informatica Cloud REST API. Let us outline a few use cases leveraging the REST API. Using the Informatica Cloud REST API, we can run a task from a third-party application or service inside the Informatica Cloud. We could dynamically create mapping configuration tasks using the Informatica Cloud REST API. You can also perform tasks such as create, update, and delete connections and schedules, start and monitor tasks, and verify the Salesforce API version. As mentioned earlier, these tasks can be executed using the Informatica Cloud REST API from a third-party application and will not require the user to log in to the Informatica Cloud org to manually execute these tasks. To use the Informatica Cloud REST API, you need a valid Informatica Cloud login and an understanding of the REST API guidelines. After understanding the Informatica Cloud REST API in detail, you can then perform a task using it. To perform a task using the API, you would first configure a request using Informatica Cloud REST API. To do this, you need to use the appropriate resource and method. You would also need to use all the applicable attributes. Informatica Cloud returns the requested information, performs the requested task, or returns an error object and related messages. We will discuss all these steps in details in the coming slides. Let us now learn some more about how to use the API in detail. Before using the API, you must review the API documentation in the Informatica Cloud Developer's Guide. This document will help you understand the REST API and its usage in more detail. It also shows you the entire list of functionalities available for the Informatica Cloud REST API. This document is available on the Informatica network, and there is a direct link to this document in the lab guide for this module. Next, we need to access the Informatica Cloud REST API XSD files. The XSD files are used to validate an XML. The Informatica Cloud REST API supports requests and responses in JSON and XML. By default, they are in XML. Hence, you need an XSD to validate the request you send and also check your response XML. To use the XSD URL, first log in to the Informatica Cloud. Then, enter the XSD URL. The URL is as shown on the screen. You can also find this URL in the Developer's Guide. If your Informatica Cloud org's login URL looks like https app2, then replace app with app2 in the URL shown on your screen. Now that we have all the resources required to use the Informatica Cloud REST API, let us start configuring a request using the REST API. A request is a message from a client to the server to perform a certain task. A request consists of a request header and a request body. To configure a request, you use an appropriate resource provided by the Informatica Cloud REST API and an HTTP method such as GET, POST, PUT, or DELETE. You would also need to use any applicable attributes as well. A complete list of resources is available in the Developer's Guide. Please note that all the resources and attributes are case-sensitive. The response from Informatica Cloud REST API will have an HTTP status code that will help you determine if the request was successful. In case of error, the HTTP status code will help you determine the cause of the error. Let us discuss the different types of response codes and what their inferences are for different types of request methods. For method type GET, if the request type is an information request, then a successful response returns the requested object. For an action request, the Informatica Cloud REST API either returns the HTTP 200 success code or Informatica Cloud REST API success object. If the request fails, the response returned from the Informatica Cloud REST API contains the HTTP 403 error, including an Informatica Cloud REST API error object. For method type POST, the successful response returned by the requested resource is the object that you created or updated. If the request fails, the response returned is HTTP 403 error, including an Informatica Cloud REST API error object. If the method type is delete and the request is successful, the Informatica Cloud REST API either returns HTTP 200 success code or Informatica Cloud REST API success object. If the request fails, the response returned from the Informatica Cloud REST API contains HTTP 403 error, including an Informatica Cloud REST API error object. The first part of any request message is the request header, so your next task is to construct the REST API request header. When you construct such a header, you must use the following format. As you can see that there are several actions in the header, We will discuss each section of the header in detail in the coming slides. Let us now discuss the first parameter in the request header, which is known as method. It is used to specify the HTTP method that you would like to use in the request, which should be GET, POST, or DELETE. Next, you need to specify the server URL. This parameter is required for most resources. This is the base URL for all the resources with the exception of login, login SF, logout all, register, and register SF resources. When you create requests, you can use a placeholder for the server URL, then replace the placeholder with the Informatica Cloud URL. The server URL will be returned by the login resource. As you can see here, the response from the login header has the server URL value. Let us now discuss the request URI property. The REST-based web services are organized into resources. A resource is a chunk of related information such as a user profile, a collection of updates, or a global user ID. Each resource is identified by one or more uniform resource identifiers. In the Informatica Cloud REST API, the resource URI is also required for most resources. For the login, login SF, logout all, register, and register SF resources, you will use the full URL listed in the resource. As discussed earlier, based on your Informatica Cloud org login URL, you might need to change the URI shown here from app to app2. The next important parameter to discuss here is the content type header. This parameter is required for POST requests. This also defines the format of the request. If you specify application JSON as the format, the request will be read as JSON, and if you specify application XML, the request will be read as XML. If a request type is not configured, Informatica Cloud uses the JSON by default. The accept header parameter is optional. It defines the response format that you want. You can use application JSON to receive the response as JSON or use application XML to receive the response as XML. If a response type is not configured, Informatica Cloud uses the JSON by default. In order to access any request in Informatica Cloud, you need to set the value of the parameter IC session ID. This parameter is required for all resources except login, login SF, logout all, register, and register SF. You use a placeholder for IC session ID and replace the placeholder with the session ID returned. The value of this parameter is not set until the user logs into the application and creates a session. So when you create requests, you can use a placeholder for the IC session ID and then replace the placeholder with the Informatica Cloud session ID. The IC session ID will be returned by the login resource. Note that session IDs are valid for 2 hours. After the session ID expires, you must log in again to continue working with the REST API. You should always use the logout resource to end the session. Let us now discuss the request body, which is second part of a request. If we need to pass any additional attributes to the resource, we use the request body. When you use the JSON format, define a request object with the @type attribute as shown here. When you pass the attributes in a request body, you pass the attributes as part of an object. For example, to log in with the login resource, you pass the required username and password attributes in a login object. So far, we have discussed how the request body looks like when the format chosen is JSON. When you use the XML format, define a request object as an enclosing set of tags as shown here. When an attribute includes an object, enclose the attribute object within the attribute tags. The same login example that we discussed for the JSON format is now shown in the XML format. In this demo, we will make use of the Informatica Cloud REST API documentation in the Informatica Cloud Developers Guide, create a login request, access the response, and finally run a data synchronization task. The purpose of this demonstration is to give you an idea about running a data synchronization task from a third-party application using the Informatica Cloud REST API. Before creating a login request, make sure that you have a REST client application installed and available for use in your browser. We recommend that you use the Google Chrome browser for the lab purposes. There are 2 REST clients recommended and they can be used as add-ons for the browser. They are Postman and Advanced REST Client Application. You can install any of them. Here's how you can install the add-on. In the Chrome browser, you can type the URL chrome.google.com/web store. Search for Postman or Advanced REST. When the add-on appears in the search results, click the Add to Chrome button to install the application. You should also download the latest version of the Informatica Cloud Developer Guide from the Informatica network. This is the guide that you would need to refer to perform the lab. The URL to download the guide is displayed on the screen. Next, you need to have a data synchronization task available in the Informatica Cloud org. So, log in to the Informatica Cloud org. Once you are logged in, go to the Task Wizards and select Data Synchronization. Select an existing task or create a new task if one does not exist. Then, select the task and click the Run Now option to verify that the task was run successfully. Once the task is executed successfully, click the task name. Notice that the URL in the browser has changed. Note down the task ID from the end of the URL. The task ID will be required to be added in the request body of the request to run the DSS task via REST. Now open the Informatica Cloud Developer Guide and navigate to the Informatica Cloud REST API section. Review the documentation on the login resource. Once you have reviewed the resource, you can create a login request. Type Chrome Apps in the Google Chrome browser to open the page that lists all the apps installed for Chrome. Locate your REST client application and open it. Enter the URL for the login resource. Select Post for the HTTP method. Click the Headers tab and in the key field, enter content type. And in the value field, enter application JSON. In the next key field, enter accept. And in the corresponding value field, enter application JSON. Click the Body tab and select the Raw option. Now type the syntax. Click the Send button to send the request. If the user is authenticated, you will see a status of 200, which means the request was sent successfully. Now let us examine the details of the response. Locate IC session ID and server URL in the response and note down the values for these, as you would need them in subsequent requests. Now, we will run a data synchronization task. Enter the server URL for the job resource which we had noted down in the previous step. Select Post for the HTTP method. Click the Headers tab and enter content type as application JSON. Accept application JSON. IC session ID. Make sure to replace the value with the IC session ID you obtained in the earlier step. Click the Body tab and select the Raw option. Now type the syntax. Examine the response by clicking the Send button. Now log in to the Informatica Cloud and navigate to Activity Monitor or Activity Log and verify that the task ran successfully. Now that you have successfully run the DSS task, you will now create a logout request. So enter the URL for the logout resource. Select Post for the HTTP method. Click the Headers tab and enter the content type as application JSON. Accept as application JSON. IC session ID as the one you obtained in the earlier step. The Body tab, select the Raw option and type @type.logout. Click the Send button to send the request. Note that no response is returned as HTTP status of 200 indicates that the logout request was successful. This concludes the logging in and running a data synchronization task using the Informatica Cloud REST API demonstration. You are now ready to take the lab on using the REST API. Please complete the associated lab for this lesson. In this lab, you will use a REST client application to access and test the login, job, and logout resources. You will use the REST client to call the login resource. From the response, you will obtain a session ID and a server URL that you can use in a subsequent request to start a data synchronization task. Finally, you will call the logout resource to end the Informatica Cloud API session. An organization provides workforce intelligence solutions that is the foundation for HR transformation. Its cloud solutions support the complete insight to action loop. This lets organizations understand and plan with precision on how to best recruit, retain, and motivate their workforce. The organization turns complex workforce data into insights, letting companies develop and align on the right people strategy and translate that strategy into actionable workforce plans. The organization does this in the cloud as a service available anytime, anywhere at a fraction of the cost of traditional solutions. The business need is to capture data from multiple HR resources such as Oracle PeopleSoft and Oracle Fusion, HCM, ADP, SAP HCM, Workday, and SuccessFactors, and transform it into a format that can be easily consumed by the organization's cloud analytics applications. They wanted to find a partner that can help them improve the usability and shorten the time to integration, increase customer satisfaction, and broaden the reach of its market. They wanted to develop new, low-touch integration process that will enable to market its analytics solutions to a broader range of companies. The HR line of business application space is highly fragmented, with many companies providing multi-point solutions, which means multiple data sources and formats that need to be transformed before they can be consumed for analysis. The organization has over 50 enterprise clients that need to have millions of rows of data updated on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis. Their existing integration process was highly serialized and labor and time intensive. The existing process also required a lot of manual intervention to run the task flows, check the activity log, and monitor to view the status. They wanted the process to be automated to the best possible extent. A solution was implemented with Informatica Cloud. The organization now has a partner that can help solve the immediate problem of getting the data from its enterprise HR business users without relying on IT for the initial and ongoing transformations. The organization used Informatica Cloud's REST API that helped to run workflows from third-party applications as web services, and information could be extracted from the applications in a very less time. The data could be updated on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis. With the help of the Informatica Cloud REST API, the tasks were run and scheduled without any manual intervention. This increased the efficiency of all the services provided by the organization. In this module, we understood the capabilities of the Informatica Cloud REST API, discussed some common use cases for the REST API, accessed and used the API documentation and XSD, configured request messages, and handled the response messages.